In the grim dawn of April 12, 1861, the first cannonball fired at Fort Sumter marked the beginning of a war that would change the face of America. Edwin Ruffin, a wealthy and influential Southern planter, had no idea that his act would not only ignite a civil war, but also set in motion the very end of the institution he held most dear, slavery. The Civil War, which began as a conflict over states' rights and Union preservation, became a struggle for the freedom of 4 million enslaved black Americans. This transformation was not planned. It was a result of the actions and decisions of countless individuals, none more significant than the enslaved people themselves. The North and the South had very different visions of what the war would achieve. Abraham Lincoln and many Northerners initially saw the conflict as a means to preserve the Union, not to end slavery. The South, on the other hand, was fighting to protect its way of life, which was deeply intertwined with the institution of slavery. However, the war quickly revealed that the fate of the Union and the fate of slavery were inseparably linked. When Northern armies began to march into Southern territory, they were not initially welcomed as liberators. The North had no official policy of freeing slaves, and many Union soldiers and officers were not abolitionists. They were fighting to restore the Union, not to dismantle the Southern economic system. Yet, as Union forces advanced, they encountered a phenomenon that would change the course of the war: the general strike of the enslaved black workers. The enslaved people did not immediately rise up in violent rebellion. They were not a homogeneous group, and their responses to the war varied widely. Some remained on their plantations, hoping that the conflict would pass them by. Others fled to Union lines, seeking refuge and the promise of freedom. Still, others joined the fight, either by enlisting in the Union Army or by providing crucial support to the Northern war effort. What united these diverse actions was a shared understanding that the war presented an opportunity to escape the bonds of slavery. The first major wave of fugitive slaves began in the summer of 1861, when Union forces established a foothold in the coastal regions of Virginia and the Carolinas. These early escapes were met with confusion and uncertainty by Union commanders. Many did not know what to do with the fugitives, and some initially tried to return them to their owners. However, the political and military significance of these actions soon became apparent. The fugitive slaves were not just escapees. They were a valuable resource that could be used to weaken the Confederate war effort. One of the most significant early events was the arrival of 3 enslaved men at Fort Monroe, Virginia, in May 1861. Major General Benjamin Butler, the Union commander at the fort, refused to return the men to their Confederate owners. Instead, he declared them contraband of war, a term that would become widely used to describe fugitive slaves. Butler's decision was a pragmatic one. He recognized that the labor of enslaved people was a vital component of the Confederate war effort. By accepting and employing these contraband, the Union could undermine the Southern economy and strengthen its own position. The impact of this decision was immediate and far-reaching. Word spread quickly among the enslaved population that Fort Monroe was a sanctuary, and more fugitives began to seek refuge there. By the end of the year, thousands of enslaved people had made their way to Union lines, and the phenomenon of contraband camps emerged. These camps became makeshift communities where the formerly enslaved could live, work, and begin to rebuild their lives. The general strike of the enslaved workers was not a single, coordinated event, but a series of individual and collective decisions. Enslaved people assessed the situation and acted on their own initiative. They left the plantations, disrupting the Southern economy and weakening the Confederate war effort. They provided the Union with valuable intelligence, labor, and, eventually, military service. Their actions were a form of resistance that was both immediate and strategic. The significance of these actions cannot be overstated. The Confederate economy was heavily dependent on the labor of enslaved people. They were the backbone of the Southern agricultural system, producing the cotton, tobacco, and other crops that fueled the Confederate war effort. When thousands of enslaved workers began to leave the plantations, it had a profound impact on the Confederate ability to sustain the war. Plantations were left understaffed, and the production of essential goods plummeted. The loss of this labor force was a blow from which the Confederacy never fully recovered. Moreover, the presence of fugitive slaves in Union lines provided a powerful moral and political argument for the abolition of slavery. As more and more enslaved people sought refuge behind Union lines, the reality of their suffering and the injustice of their condition became impossible to ignore. The Union government, initially reluctant to address the issue of slavery, began to recognize that the war could not be won without addressing the issue of human bondage. In 1862, the Union Congress passed the Confiscation Act, which declared that any property used to support the Confederate war effort, including enslaved people, could be confiscated. This was a significant step toward the abolition of slavery, as it recognized that enslaved people were a legitimate tool of war. The following year, in January 1863, President Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, which declared that all enslaved people in Confederate-held territories were free. While the proclamation did not immediately free all enslaved people, it was a powerful statement of intent and a turning point in the war. The Emancipation Proclamation was not just a moral victory. It also had practical implications for the Union war effort. It allowed the Union to recruit black soldiers, who would play a crucial role in the final stages of the war. By the end of the conflict, nearly 180,000 black men had served in the Union Army, and another 20,000 in the Navy. These soldiers fought with distinction, proving their valor and courage on the battlefield, and contributing significantly to the Union victory. The general strike of the enslaved workers was a decisive factor in the Union's ultimate success. By withdrawing their labor from the Confederate cause and offering it to the Union, they transformed the war from a conflict over states' rights into a struggle for freedom. Their actions were a form of resistance that was both immediate and strategic, and they played a crucial role in the eventual defeat of the Confederacy. In the end, the Civil War was not just a military conflict, it was a social revolution. The war brought about the end of slavery and laid the foundation for the civil rights movement that would follow. The actions of the enslaved workers, who courageously sought their own freedom, were a key part of this transformation. They did not just wait for freedom to be granted. They fought for it, and in doing so, they changed the course of American history. The Civil War was a turning point in the struggle for human rights, and the enslaved workers who participated in the general strike were its unsung heroes. Their actions remind us that the fight for freedom is a collective effort, and that the actions of ordinary people can have extraordinary consequences. The Civil War may have been won on the battlefield, but it was the courage and determination of the enslaved workers that truly secured the victory.